This video covers the shared responsibility model. Security and compliance are shared responsibilities between AWS and customers. AWS operates, manages, and controls security of the cloud. This responsibility includes securing components from the host operating system and virtualization layer down to the physical security of the facilities where the service operates. AWS is responsible for protecting the global infrastructure that runs all the services that are offered in the AWS cloud. The infrastructure is composed of the hardware, software, networking, and facilities that run AWS cloud services. You assume responsibility and management in the cloud. The security steps that you must take depend on the services that you use and the complexity of your system. Customer responsibilities include selecting and securing operating systems that run on EC2 instances and securing the applications that are launched on AWS resources. Customers must also select and handle security group configurations, firewall configurations, network configurations, and secure account management. Customers are also responsible for managing their data, including encryption options. Consider an example where your company uses Amazon S3 to store data. Your AWS environment also includes EC2 instances and an Amazon Relational Database Service, or Amazon RDS instance. These resources run a MySQL database, which is deployed inside a VPC. One EC2 instance hosts a web server, and the web application that runs on it uses the database to store application data. In this scenario, AWS is responsible for protecting the global infrastructure, which contains the physical servers that host the virtual machines and storage hardware. These virtual machines and storage hardware host your S3 bucket, EC2 instances, and database instance. AWS is responsible for the security of the physical networking infrastructure that ensures that these components can be accessed. AWS is also responsible for the security of the hypervisor layer that hosts the EC2 instances. You, the customer, are responsible for managing the guest OS that runs on the EC2 instances, including Microsoft Windows or Linux OS updates and security patches. You're also responsible for managing any application software or utilities that you install. Additionally, you are responsible for the configuration of the security groups that control network access to each EC2 instance and to the RDS database instance. Finally, you're also responsible for configuring security on the S3 bucket and the objects that you store in it. While AWS secures and maintains the cloud infrastructure, you are responsible for securing everything that you put in the cloud. Before you architect any workload, put practices in place that influence security. You want to control who can do what. In addition, you want to be able to identify security incidents, protect your systems and services, and maintain the confidentiality and integrity of data through data protection. You should have a well-defined and practiced process to respond to security incidents. These tools and techniques are important because they support objectives such as preventing financial loss or complying with regulatory obligations. When using AWS services, you maintain complete control over your content and are responsible for managing critical security requirements, including the following: the content you choose to store in AWS, the AWS services that are used with the content, the country that the content is stored in, the format and structure of the content and whether it is masked, anonymized, or encrypted, and who has access to that content and how those access rights are granted, managed, and revoked. Now let's complete an activity about the shared responsibility model. The purpose of this activity is to examine whether AWS or the customer is responsible for the security of various components in an architecture. Consider this scenario. A customer uses Amazon S3 to store data. The customer manages a VPC that contains an EC2 instance and an Oracle database instance. Pause the video for a few minutes and think about who's responsible for each item on the slide, AWS or the customer. When you're ready, continue the video and we'll review the answers. Okay, let's look at the answers. First, upgrades and patches to the operating system on the EC2 instance are a customer responsibility. Number 2, the physical security of the data center, and number 3, virtualization infrastructure, are AWS responsibilities. Number 4, EC2 security group settings, and number 5, configuration of applications that run on the EC2 instance, are customer responsibilities. Number 6, if the Oracle instance runs an Amazon RDS instance, AWS is responsible for Oracle upgrades or patches. But number 7, if Oracle runs on an EC2 instance, then the customer is responsible for those upgrades and patches. And finally, number 8, S3 bucket access configuration is a customer responsibility. Now consider a different architecture. This VPC has a subnet. The subnet has an EC2 instance with a web server which can retrieve objects from an S3 bucket. An internet gateway is associated with the subnet to allow communication between the web server and the internet. Users can connect to the web server through the AWS Management Console or through the AWS CLI by using an SSH key. Pause the video for a few minutes and think about who's responsible for each item on the slide, AWS or the customer. When you're ready, continue the video and we'll review the answers. Okay, let's look at the answers. Number 1, AWS is responsible to ensure that the AWS Management Console isn't hacked. Number 2, configuring the subnet, and number 3, configuring the VPC are both customer responsibilities. Number 4, protecting against network outages in AWS regions is an AWS responsibility. Number 5, the customer must secure the SSH keys. Number 6, ensuring network isolation between AWS customers' data. And number 7, ensuring a low latency network connection between the web servers and the S3 bucket are AWS responsibilities. And finally, the customer is responsible for number 8, enforcing multi-factor authentication for all users' logins. One approach to implement security and governance is to create a centralized team that is responsible for establishing reputable processes. This team also creates templates to deploy applications to AWS while maintaining organizational control over deployments. Such a team could be either internal or external and is referred to as a provisioning team or managed services organization, also known as an MSO. External vendors are commonly referred to as managed service providers or MSPs. AWS validates AWS partners under the AWS MSP program. MSOs or MSPs are typically responsible for provisioning accounts, establishing reputable processes for deployment, auditing the deployment of workload owners, and hosting shared services for security, continuous monitoring, connectivity, and authentication. MSOs essentially create the guardrails for security, data protection, and disaster recovery in the company. In the MSO model, workload owners handle the actual deployment, development, and maintenance of applications. Workload owners typically include system administrators, developers, and others who are directly responsible for one or more applications. Adding an MSO helps ensure that applications are deployed in a secure and compliant fashion through the automated implementation of organizational security requirements. Having an MSO also means that the workload owner can scope down their authorization documentation to only the configuration and installation of software that is specific to a particular application. This is because the workload owner inherits a significant portion of the security control implementation from the MSO. AWS customer MSOs often perform the following activities: account provisioning, security oversight, VPC configuration, IAM configuration, development and approval of templates, AMI creation and management, and development of a shared services VPC. Here are the key takeaways for this section of the module. The AWS Shared Responsibility model helps organizations that adopt the cloud to achieve their security and compliance goals. Customers are responsible for securing everything they put in the cloud. And finally, an MSO essentially creates the guardrails for security, data protection, and disaster recovery. Thanks for watching.